It began in the early 1800s. No one knows why exactly, but then mystery is always an element of faith, and faith is the issue here. A powerful wave of religious enthusiasm swept the countryside and then the cities of America between about 1800 and 1850. Rural revivals took place in settings very much like this arbor at Newberry, Texas, where such events still happen. In the early 1800s, people would come from miles around for the revival meetings. Hundreds and perhaps thousands joined to pray and sing and to camp for a week or two in fields nearby. Preachers in each corner of the field would urge them to repent and believe. Emotional conversions convulsed the assembled flock. They were assured they were safe in the bosom of Jesus. For over 200 years, the alleluias and amens of religious fervor have reverberated throughout America. This reflects, I think, one of the most enduring characteristics of American life, the continued search for meaning and certainty. In the midst of these dramatic events, a significant change in religion in America was occurring. More and more preachers were admonishing people that one way to improve the soul was to improve life, to remake society. Thus, doing battle for the Lord meant doing battle against social ills, such as drunkenness and mental illness. Religion then provided energy for the social reformers of the early 19th century. Who can say what caused the religious fervor to take hold of this country? The rootlessness of an ever-expanding society? The uneasiness of a rising industrial economy and its altered lifestyles? The new responsibilities of the common man in politics? Or the fearful economic turmoil of boom and bust? But people felt threatened by changes beyond their control. They sought constancy and meaning in this fast-changing world. Three great changes were transforming the 19th century republic. The political revolution we call Jacksonian democracy had brought more and more people into the political process. The Industrial Revolution drew more and more people away from farms and into an urban and commercial environment. And this powerful surge of revivalism and reform sought to perfect the human spirit. I do wonder why all these forces came at this particular place in time. To find an answer, I visited Professor Harvey Graff of the University of Texas, Dallas. I asked him to explain why this burst of religious and reforming zeal came now.
In a nutshell, both the evangelical fires, as they were then called, and the long and complex array of reforms that accompanied them and followed them had their origins in the nature of the development of American society in the early 19th century and in the several decades that had preceded it. We should look for no one factor to help explain this. A variety of cultural, economic, and social causes and currents came together in helping to stimulate this kind of activity. From the mid-18th century Enlightenment came a stress on human perfectibility and progress. From Romanticism came an impetus on the individual and his or her place in the spiritual and natural world. From republicanism and new nationhood came the goal of egalitarianism and, in theory, equal opportunity for all persons. These cultural currents interacted with a rapidly changing economy and society. In particular, young people and women, as well as thousands of other people, struggled to find a sense of themselves in the world. Many of them doubted that they could any longer follow in the footsteps of their mothers and fathers, and the concerns about their own immediate future in a material sense, and their long-term future in a spiritual and salvation sense racked them. It led many of them to engage in the hundreds of revivals spreading across the country, across urban and rural areas. In their search for salvation, both in the immediate sense of their material lives and their salvation in a much larger, longer-term spiritual sense, came a practical need for the change not just of themselves, but the need to change society, in essence, to save society. This led many of them to combine involuntary societies in efforts to reform the world in which they lived.
These many factors promoted a religious independence. Many people felt sure they knew how to save society, but this salvation could only be accomplished their way. Not everyone agreed on just what that way was. Various leaders and their followers struck out on their own. Some tried to create a society that conformed more, they thought, to human longings. They tried to create little Edens or utopian societies. The societies generally were held together by strict rules. This one is called Fruitland, near Boston. It was formed by a gentle but impractical philosopher named Brunson Alcott. Here, as in other similar communities, the idea was to renounce the works of the world as too materialistic. Salvation, people were told, came from shunning the vulgar and the frivolous. They were to seek more spiritual existence. The labor, capital, and culture were to be shared. Men in peasant blouses were divided into groups to plow, tend cattle, and harvest. The women were dressed in muslin and calico. No cotton was allowed because it was grown by slaves. The women were to supervise the kitchen, the dining room, and the nursery. Here at Fruitlands, horses and oxen were not to be forced to do anything. Insects were not to be harassed. No one was to eat meat, fish, or poultry, nor were men to raise any but aspiring vegetables. These were the vegetables that grew upward. Apparently no potatoes, no turnips, or the like were allowed. In fact, the main diet was supposed to be acorns. Yes, acorns. Perhaps because they certainly aspired, they became great oaks. In the evening, all were to gather to discuss the nature of God, the perfectibility of man, and other lofty thoughts. Both men and women preferred the high-flown talk to the coarser labor of the day. Fruitlands lasted about 6 months. Today, Alcott is known chiefly because his daughter, Louisa May, wrote Little Women. Other communities also hoped to be Little Edens. One was founded by John Humphrey Noyes in Oneida, New York. Here, not only property was shared, but people as well. Love was to be given, not claimed, according to Noyes. Everyone was married to everyone else. They experimented with scientific breeding. At first, things went splendidly. Some 40 young men offered themselves as part, they said, of any combination that may seem desirable. But outraged neighbors believed that old Satan himself was lurking behind the pious posturings. Howls of complaints mounted. Oneida's system collapsed. Noyes fled to Canada. Oneida, however, still exists as a very respectable and thriving center of silverware manufacture. Of course, it's easy today to make fun of those utopian reformers, but in general, they were completely sincere, dedicated men and women. They really thought it was possible to make a heaven on earth. Think how lofty their goals were, how gallant their efforts, how courageous their self-sacrifice. But rigid codes of behavior do not a heaven make. The American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson understood this well. He said that the communities met all the tests except that of life. They could not accommodate to the strong, free, individualistic impulse. 19th century Americans were no better collectivists than Americans are today. Other reformers, from about 1825 to 1850, could point to clear and important successes. Improvements were made in hospital hygiene. The criminally insane were treated more humanely. Floggings on land and sea were abolished. The first national trades union was founded. Temperance societies sprang up to control drunkenness, which was rampant. Even the conditions of prison life were improved. As one contemporary remarked, society is dizzy with ideas to improve the human race. Well, not quite. The greatest effort at reform eventually helped split the Republic. It was abolition. On July 4th, 1829, an unassuming young man approached the pulpit in this, the Park Street Church in Boston, and delivered a revolutionary sermon. The man, William Lloyd Garrison, his message, abolition of slavery.
On this day of independence, within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty, I state that blacks are not Africans but Americans. They are not subjects but citizens. This is their country by birth, not by adoption. They are therefore entitled to the same rights set forth in the Declaration of Independence as other Americans. Until they obtain those rights, the American Revolution will not be over.
Many people who were there that day remembered his sermon all their lives. Garrison woke up a part of their natures that had been sleeping. What he said was so sensible and so true. People felt they had been blind not to see this truth before. Garrison's fame soon spread from this church throughout the city of Boston and finally throughout the United States. He founded a newspaper, The Liberator, not far from here. In his first article, he declared he would write the truth regardless of the consequences.
On the subject of slavery, I do not intend to think or speak or write with moderation. No. No! Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell the mother to gradually remove her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will be heard!
And heard he was. The American Anti-Slavery Society he founded invited men to give speeches against slavery. One such man was the ex-slave Frederick Douglass. In the year 1838, when he was 21, he escaped to the North. He knew what slavery was. And in churches and meeting houses across the country, he described it with powerful eloquence.
The slave is a human being, reduced to the level of a brute, a mere chattel, in the eye of the law, placed beyond the circle of human brotherhood, cut off from his kind. In law, a slave has no wife, no children, no country, no home. He can own nothing but what must belong to another. He toils that another may reap the fruit. He is industrious that another may live in idleness. He eats unbolted meal that another may eat the bread of fine flour. He labors in chains at home under a burning sun and a biting lash that another may ride in ease and splendor abroad. He lives in ignorance that another may be educated. He is abused that another may be exalted. He rests his tired limbs on the cold, damp ground that another may repose on the softest pillow. He is sheltered only by a wretched hovel that a master may dwell in a magnificent mansion. And to this condition, he is bound down as by an arm of iron. It is only when we contemplate the slave as a moral and intellectual being that we can adequately comprehend the unparalleled enormity of slavery and the intense criminality of the slaveholder.
Douglass deeply moved people, whereas Garrison tended to irritate them. Garrison even made it difficult for his friends to defend him. He was arrogant. He burned a copy of the Declaration of Independence. He seemed willing to tear down the Constitution, the courts, the laws, everything for the sake of abolition. On one occasion, a group of men in the community caught Garrison and dragged him through the streets of Boston with a rope around his neck. Relations between Garrison and Douglass also changed. Part of the problem was that Garrison was a bit jealous of Douglass's increasing fame. Garrison once told Douglass, who spoke much better than he did, to use more darky phrases when he spoke. In this way, people would be more certain that he had been a slave. Douglass, for his part, began to break away from Garrison. He said that those who had suffered from slavery should now carry on the battle. Garrison called Douglass ungrateful for the help he had received from Garrison. But both admired one remarkable woman. She was Harriet Tubman, who led about 300 slaves to freedom on what was called the Underground Railroad. Time and again, she went back to the South to bring out more slaves.
I was not deeply afraid. I used to tell the people I took north, you'll be free or die. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other, for no man would take me alive.
Like Harriet Tubman, other women were also working hard for the abolition of slavery. But in doing so, they came to the painful realization that they too were, in many ways, slaves. Here, in this house on Washington Street in Seneca Falls, New York, Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived. Stanton and her friend, Lucretia Mott, presided over a series of meetings resulting in the first Women's Rights Convention. Some years before, the two women had attended a World Anti-Slave Convention in London. But to their astonishment, they were told it was for men only. Women had to sit silently in the gallery for the 10 days of the meeting. The two women came to realize that they were slaves of men, of custom, of husbands, and of habit. They determined to change all that. In the summer of 1848, Stanton and Mott met with women in homes throughout the Seneca Falls area. They drew up a Declaration of Rights or Principles for Women. It followed the style of the Declaration of Independence. Then they put a notice in the Seneca County Courier saying that a meeting would be held to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. At the last minute, they had doubts, even a sense of panic about the entire enterprise. After all, in the last century, women just did not do certain things, and holding public meetings was one of them. Also, Mrs. Stanton had inserted a phrase about women's right to vote in the Declaration. Mr. Stanton swore that unless she took that out, he would leave home. She didn't, and he did. Even Mrs. Mott was aghast. "Thou will make us look ridiculous. We must go slow," she told her friend. Nevertheless, the phrase remained. The meeting was set for July 19th. One young woman arrived with horse and wagon, accompanied by a girlfriend from school. Her name was Charlotte Woodward. She wondered,
will anyone else come? Will anyone pay attention to us? This is the meeting hall. Get out of the wagon. What's the matter? Oh, don't be silly. Of course we're going in. We've come all this way. Why are you embarrassed? You have a right to be here. Come on now. I can hardly believe it. Look at all the people. Quick, there are 2 vacant chairs. I never. There must be close on 300 people in here. And there are some men here, too. I never dreamed this many people would come to talk about the problems of women. That large lady over there must be Mrs. Stanton. She looks a little nervous. I don't blame her. I couldn't get up in front of a crowd like this. Oh, she's getting up now.
I should feel exceedingly diffident to appear before you this time if I were not nerved by a sense of right and duty. Did I not feel that the time had come for the question of women's wrongs to be laid before the public? Did I not believe that woman herself must do this work? For woman alone can understand the height, the depth, the length, and the breadth of her degradation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Man has denied women the inalienable right to vote. He has compelled her to submit to laws she had no voice in making. He has made her, if married, civilly dead in the eyes of the law. He has taken from her all rights to property, even to the wages she earns. Man has established a different code of morals for men and women. We declare that all laws which prevent women from occupying such a station in society as her conscience shall dictate are contrary to the great precept of nature, and therefore of no force or authority.
The meeting was a splendid success. All the resolutions passed unanimously, except the one on women's right to vote. But that too did pass. And the expected ridicule was not long in coming. Some of the editorials ran like this: "That was the most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of womanity." Yes, that's what it said, womanity. Here's another: "Such unwomanly behavior. Equal rights would demoralize and degrade women and prove a monstrous injury to all mankind." And a third: These Amazons set forth the preposterous notion that all men and women are created equal. The convention was simply a petticoat rebellion arranged by love-starved spinsters. But the women went right ahead. They spoke at meetings, lobbied Congress, wrote articles. By the time of the Fourth Convention for Women's Rights in New York City, free black women had joined the movement, but were not always accepted. When one of them, Sojourner Truth, got up to speak, a terrifying eruption of shouts, jeers, and hisses greeted her.
I know that it feels a kind of hissing and tickling, uncomfortable like to see a colored woman get up and tell you about things and women's rights. We have all been thrown down so low that nobody thought we'd ever get up again. But see if we don't. And you can't stop us. See if you can. You may hiss as much as you'd like, but it is coming. I'm sitting among you to watch. And every once in a while, I will come out and tell you what time of night it is.
Despite the efforts of Sojourner Truth and all the women, an enormous amount of prejudice remained against changing women's status. One issue would haunt the 19th century women's rights movement. When the subject came up, someone always asked, were women really equal to or the same as men? Weren't they mentally inferior and therefore incapable of voting intelligently? Wasn't the female brain incapable of dealing with such subjects as politics and mathematics? If so, shouldn't men protect them and be their legal guardians? Shouldn't these childlike women with their tiny lady brains be spared the trouble of handling their own money or property? Lucretia Mott one day calmly admitted that centuries of repression and lack of education might have caused women to appear mentally inferior. But this was not a basis to assume the condition could not be corrected. But just suppose, she said, women really weren't on the whole as bright as men. That would still be no reason for denying them their basic human rights. As she said, does one man have fewer rights than another because his intellect is inferior? If not, why should a woman? Still, the meetings in this house were only the beginnings of a struggle that lasted 70 years just to get the right to vote. Of all the people who attended that first women's meeting, only Charlotte Woodward was alive to vote, when women were first allowed to do so in 1920. Yet such sensitivity was shown during this time to other social ills. Great reforms took place in America in other fields. Again, I went to Dr. Graff and asked him what were the differences and similarities between the struggles for abolition and women's rights.
Antebellum abolitionists and those involved in the early women's rights movement shared a fascinating combination of similarities and key differences. Both stem from similar origins that developed over the preceding century within the Western world. Both in large part grew from the struggle to achieve democratic egalitarian rights, in theory for all people, a struggle that had erupted in a multiple series of democratic revolutions during the second half of the 18th century. These included most prominently the French Revolution and, of course, of immediate relevance here, the American Revolution. Both abolitionism and early women's rights movements should be viewed as part of a larger transatlantic transformation across the Western world. That set of transformations had to do with democratic theory, with an expansion of suffrage for more and more different kind of people, with a changing set of ideological goals focusing on the individual and his or her advancement, and also a desire to remove the remaining obstacles to the freedom and advancement and the opportunity of all people. Both movements drew upon the currents of pietism and evangelicalism of the early 19th century. Often these were the currents that brought men and women together into abolitionist activities. And abolition activities provided a very important kind of basic training for a number of women who emerged as leaders as well as foot soldiers in the women's rights movements of the 19th century. Women did not need abolitionism. They didn't need, in other words, the example of the slave in order to teach them about their discontent, their own sense of their poor position and the limitations on their rights was as much a cause as an effect of their involvement in abolitionism. But from abolitionism, they learned a great deal. It was a kind of practical training in organization, in tactics, in ideology, in the need for a larger desire to communicate, to develop a mass movement for their concerns. Equally importantly, abolitionism gave a number of women a sense of self-confidence, as well as a sense of the truth of their own concern. In the end, though, the differences, for the sake of the 19th century, were perhaps more important. Women found their concern for rights and suffrage, placed in a decidedly secondary position when the Civil War came and when the desire was made, a decision was made by abolitionists and Republicans that the rights of the Negro would come first. Here, women began to learn that they would have to develop their own movement.
The period of reform was energized by a great burst of religious zeal from the 1820s through the 1850s. There was a desire to be more worthy of salvation, a desire to ease the pain and condition of one's fellow human beings. Much of this spirit was fostered by religious revivals and tent meetings. They are still functioning, an interesting American institution. I believe that America was born with a reforming zeal. People instinctively knew that in this new land, there was a chance to rebuild society. Here could be avoided all the mistakes made in the old world. Everything could be rethought, redone, rebuilt, closer to human needs and desires, closer to what people thought God had intended the world to be in the first place. But as reformers discovered, reform means change. And at this time, there were limits on the willingness of Americans to change things. Much was reformed, but two of the greatest problems of the nation remained unsolved in the middle of the 19th century: the issue of slavery and the issue of women's rights.
The preceding program was funded in part by Frito-Lay.